Hello, I'm Mitch.
And I'm Rosalie.
Zionism, the return of the Jewish people to the land. Obviously, you think it was a Jew who founded modern Zionism, right? Let's retrace history and see. Stay tuned on The Crossover.
We'll be right back.
For nearly 2,000 years, Jews and Christians have been divided. But now, God is calling for the healing of past hurts and the comforting of His people. Discover how God is prophetically uniting Jews and Christians across the world today on The Crossover. Here is your host, Mitch Jerome.
John McTernan founded Branch of David Ministries. He's co-founder of International Cops for Christ. John is an apologist and appears on numerous TV and radio programs defending his Christian faith. He's the author of many books, such as Israel, the Blessing or the Curse, and As America Has Done to Israel. John, welcome to the show. Glad to have you back.
Thank you for having me.
You bet. We want to cover today Zionism and the Christian influence, if there was one, and you're going to disclose that for us. And why don't you first define for our viewers, John, what is even Zionism?
Well, the way I would define Zionism is the right for the Jewish people to have a homeland in their biblical homeland, really what we call today Israel. So it's the right for them to go back to the nation of Israel.
And so let's look at that from a couple of different angles here. Why don't you take us back into, I guess, the late 1800s and what was going on in the church in America, what was going on in Europe?
In the late 1800s, there was tremendous turmoil for the Jewish people in Europe, specifically Russia. In 1881, Tsar Alexander II was assassinated, and the government and the people blamed the Jews on it. And why, I could never determine in studying history, but it was like sort of a spontaneous eruption of anti-Semitism. And it resulted in pogroms that really went on. It started, you could pinpoint 1881, continuing right up to the Russian Revolution and communism. And the Russians were vicious towards the Jews. When I speak about this, I call it was like the national sport of Russia.
Wow.
It was just
persecuting Jews?
Yes, oh yeah. And
how many Jews were persecuted in Russia?
It's hard to say. I mean, there was the largest Jewish population in the world at that time was in Russia.
Okay.
It was substantial.
Okay.
And the Russians didn't want the Jews there. They had expelled, under Catherine the Great, they'd expelled all the Jews from Russia in 1727. But then after Russia annexed Poland in 1770, they took in a substantial amount of Jews. And the Jews were only allowed in a certain area. They were only allowed a certain area. And it was called the Pale of Settlement. And I believe that's partly where we get that expression, beyond the pale. You know, the Jews were not allowed to move out of that area.
Okay.
They were confined in there.
And what was the Jewish population in Russia, would you guess?
I'm going to say 6 to 8 million,
okay.
I believe. I could be off on that, but I remember coming across it once, and I was shocked at the amount of Jews that were in Russia.
So the Jews are the scapegoat for that assassination?
Yeah. So now the picture we have is for approximately 100 years, the Jews are boiled, or they're compressed into this area, and they're just at the whim of whatever czar and whatever governor is in charge, for being subject to terrible persecution. In 1881, starting in March of 1881, there is this vicious pogrom that results in May of 1882 in what's called, history records or identifies as the May Laws. And these were specific laws where the Jews were forbidden to do this, forbidden to do that, forbidden, forbidden, forbidden. And if the Jews had lived, if they had gone beyond the pale of settlement for whatever reason, now all the land was confiscated, their business was confiscated,
wow.
Their homes were confiscated, and they were driven back into that area. They weren't allowed to worship Judaism, you know. They had to...
They had synagogues? They couldn't even go to synagogue? Is that what you're saying?
They were prevented. I don't
underground?
know. See, yeah, I think it was more they had to go underground now. And they were forced to observe the Russian Orthodox holidays. among other things. And I remember the children were not allowed to be educated and all that. And the Russian Jews, just between the physical attacks and now these laws that were stacked against them, in mass, thousands and thousands just started to walk west, because at that point, at that time, the border, Germany bordered Russia. There was no Poland. And the Russian Jews, they heard about America. They called it the famous land. I've got this all documented in my book, what we're discussing. And they heard that America accepted Jews, that Jews were free in America, that you could worship through Judaism and it wasn't, you weren't tortured.
Freedom of religion. There.
Freedom of religion, right.
So let's hop the ocean, take us to America.
Exactly.
And
So what happens is millions of Jews, now eventually it's several million Jews, leave Russia, and they literally had no idea how they were going to get to America. They just wanted out of Russia. They walked into Germany, and the European Jewry and individual Germans raised money, and they would actually house the Jewish people, get them on boats, and send them to the United States. But isn't it sad
so
that
American Jewry?
No, European Jewry.
European Jewry, okay.
European and individual Germans, not the German government, but individual Germans. They helped these Russian Jews get out of Russia to America. Well, in America, America opened their arms wide. The Jews primarily came to New York City, and as many Jews came, they were allowed to come in. Isn't that amazing? Mm-hmm. So Europe didn't want them. The Russians didn't want them. In fact, I have a quote in my book from the, I don't know what his title is, but the head of the Russian Orthodox Church. They wanted a third of the Russians to leave, Russian Jews. They wanted a third to convert, and they wanted to kill a third. That's pretty rough language. And that's from a religious leader.
But to stay there, you were a second-class citizen and you didn't have any rights. So
no rights.
period.
And you were subject to the whim of any soldier, of any government official, of the Tsar, to be tortured. And so you have now hundreds of thousands of Russian Jews pouring into the United States. Starting with George Washington onward, America is unique in blessing the Jewish people. Now, I've spoken to many Jews about this and many Gentiles about this, and no one knows American history in this area. It's amazing the information I'm bringing out in the book.
So give us an example there.
Well, George Washington literally said, and I've got letters that he wrote to Jewish congregations in the United States in 1789, 1790, where he said that the God of Israel, the God that delivered the Jewish people from Egypt, is the same God that founded these United States. He linked the God of Israel with the United States, and he said, "Blessed is that nation whose God is the Lord." He actually quoted Psalm 144, verse 15.
Okay. Was he president at this time?
He's the president.
At the time he's declaring this. Okay.
Declaring this. In another letter, he wrote to the Jewish congregation where everyone will sit under their own vine tree and under their own fig tree, and there'll be peace. He actually quoted that in his letter to the Jewish people, that's the way he wanted the United States to be for the Jewish people. Isn't that amazing? He wanted America to be like the Messianic reign. And so you contrast that with these European tyrants and everything that's going on, and here you've got a country that wants to bless and wants the Jewish people to come.
Sure.
Our benevolent attitude towards Jewish people today, and especially Israel, didn't start in 1948 when Israel became a nation, or 1960 or 70 or 80. It started back it's part of the foundation of our country, set by George Washington, and then later enhanced by Abraham Lincoln.
More of The Crossover when we return. The Crossover presents Jewish Christian Relations.
Take to me a 3-year-old heifer, and a 3-year-old goat, and a 3-year-old ram, and a turtle dove, and a young dove. And he took all these to God, and he cut them in the center, and placed each piece opposite its counterpart. The birds, however, he did not cut up. And Jewish tradition teaches that these three animals symbolize Egypt, Rome, and Ishmael. Nations that stood up against the voice of religion, against the voice of a religion of peace and love and universal morality. But the birds he did not cut. And Jewish tradition says that the birds are Israel. And the birds fly, and the birds must fly with a message to the four corners of the globe to teach about this God of love and compassion and morality. But there are two birds, not just one. And for years I studied this text and I couldn't imagine why were there two birds. We're one nation. And then I studied a little bit about Jewish history and realized that until the destruction of the Second Temple, we understood that we had a mission to the world. We understood, as God said to Abraham, through you shall be blessed all the families of the earth. But after the destruction of the temple and we were wandering from pillar to post, we lost our sense of mission. Survival was so difficult, we didn't spread that word. But you did. And then I began to understand that those two birds are you and us. With a united mission. A mission to go to the four corners of the globe, teaching a God of love and morality and justice and compassion.
Welcome back to The Crossover.
So in America, it's not just the evangelical church as it seems to be today. You're talking the mainstream churches.
Yes.
Were embracing
Yes.
this idea of
Right.
bringing in the Jews, and they will have their land.
Yes.
Okay, so carry on.
One man in particular came to the forefront. His name was William Blackstone. And he was basically an evangelist out of Chicago. And I don't know exactly how it happened, but he became the representative of this movement. So you have the movement sort of crystallizing in his leadership, William Blackstone. And then you have the church seeing how destitute and how poverty-stricken and how, I guess you would say, beaten down the Russian Jews were. Mm. They were coming out of terror. Sure. In Russia, and it touched the heart of the church. The church really responded to this. They worked for housing for the Jewish people, medical care for the Jewish people, food for the Jewish people. They worked with Jewish agencies to help these Russian Jews pouring into America. The church really reached out to help the Russian Jews. But here's the strange thing about this. The American Christians, the American evangelical Christians, were the spearhead for the idea of the creation of a Jewish state. The American Jews were kind of reserved about this. Isn't that strange?
They were happy here in Babylon, or what? Things were going well, and they just came from overseas?
Yeah, I think that's part of it. I think that part of it was, well, the American Jews were very prosperous in America. They had tremendous freedom. They had been elected governors. They had been elected mayors. They had reached prominent positions in business and banking and all. That may be part of it. But the American church had this theological basis that the Jews should have their own homeland. So you have this revival going on in America, and then you throw gasoline on it with the Russian Jews pouring in from Europe, and the American church, again headed by Blackstone, said it's time for a Jewish homeland. Isn't that amazing? And Blackstone sent a letter to the Tsar.
How did he take it?
Ignored it.
Okay.
But he sent a letter to the Tsar, stop what you're doing against the Russian Jews.
Okay, the Tsar didn't
The Tsar
have any
ignored it.
interest.
No.
But how did Blackstone respond?
Well, what he did was Blackstone obtained the support of approximately 400 key Americans. Now, it's actually more than 400. And he says in his writings that he could have gotten thousands. It was signed by the Chief Justice of the United States. It was signed by the Speaker of the House, numerous congressmen. It was signed by mayors of major cities, by governors. It was signed by the editorial heads of like 93 major newspapers. It was signed by John Rockefeller and Morgan, all the bankers and all that. And then prominent Christians like D.L. Moody, the great evangelist back then. And also...
And this was before the days of TV evangelists and all
Yes.
that. This was just one man in one church? Or was he heading up a...
No, he was basically an evangelist.
Okay.
Yeah. And
But he had all these industrialists, presidents,
Yes.
bankers.
this was broad, widespread.
Okay.
And he met with President Harrison and Secretary of State Blaine in March of 1891 and presented them with this document asking the United States to call for an international conference for the creation of a Jewish homeland in Palestine. Isn't that
So-
amazing?
And that was called What Shall Be Done for the Russian Jew, John,
Yes,
is what they called
that's
it
what it
before
was
it was
called.
called the
Right.
Blackstone Memorial.
Right.
Now that is amazing. So he got the president's attention. Now, so what did Harrison, so here he goes, he has the ear of the president. I think you said he personally got to meet the president.
Yes,
This wasn't
yes.
just done by mail.
Right, it was done personally. He personally met Harrison and the Secretary of State Blaine.
And what I found interesting in your book, you were saying in that meeting, he actually quoted scripture to the president.
Well, he presented a cover letter, and in the cover letter, he had many scriptures, and primarily I think it was Ezekiel 35, and he was actually telling the president that the Jewish people have a covenant with that land, that is their land, and it's time for a homeland. And this is the American church doing this
Right.
before a decade before the Zionist movement, which was spawned by the Jewish people.
So how influential was then this letter in approaching the president to getting an effect?
Started a real focus on the Jewish people and their plight. It really brought it to the forefront. Millions
So
of
now we're on the front page.
Yes, millions of Americans are praying, fasting, interceding
Wow.
for God to create a homeland for the Jewish people.
And
the
again, this was
now there
mainly the Christian base.
in
again.
America.
Yeah.
Now there was some in Great Britain. There was some of the same attitude in Great Britain, and really no other country. But the very heart of it, the very heart of what was going on, was in the United States. Now, Mitch, I have a quote in the book from Louis Brandeis, who was an associate Supreme Court justice. He was probably at the time the world's leading Zionist. Brilliant legal mind in that. Anyways, he invites William Blackstone to speak at the International Zionist Congress in Philadelphia in 1916. And he gives Blackstone the lead speaker in it. And his introduction to Blackstone, he attributes Blackstone as being the father of modern Zionism, not Herzl.
Not Herzl.
He specifically says not Herzl.
Wow.
He said Herzl just got his ideas from Blackstone.
Wow, and this is coming from an influential Jewish man.
Yeah, and I mean, this is stunning to hear, because the Jews don't know this, and the Christians don't know this, but the leading Zionist in the world back 100 years ago attributed the father of Zionism to not a Jew, but to American Christian
Yeah,
evangelists.
that is phenomenal.
And
And how many Jewish people even
no
ever
one
heard
knows this.
Yeah.
That's why I've got the quote. I have Brandeis' quote right in my book. And Blackstone never gave up. He presented the Blackstone Memorial again to President Wilson. And then finally in 1922, there was a joint resolution in Congress, both the House and the Senate, calling for the United States to recognize a Jewish homeland in
In
Palestine.
the land of Palestine there.
Right. So it starts in the church in the 1870s, accelerates in the 1880s, really accelerates in the 1890s, and then it spills over into the political realm.
Right. And
Right.
it gets done eventually.
Right, and it gets done.
And it's amazing how, so when I read this, John, how one man, again, it doesn't take a lot, made a difference, had an influence, persisted in his vision, stood on this truth of the Scripture.
Yes.
I mean,
Well, that was the driving engine of this, was the Scriptures, the Bible, and the covenant.
Yeah, and then hence birthed Zionism in America, and it came from the Christian arena. We just have a few minutes left, and I wanted you to share a little bit, because you are a Christian with a heart for Israel and the Jewish people, and this has been your ministry for years, and your books that you write. And just speak to our viewers a little bit. I mean, there's a lot of awesome Christians out there that are just content with their salvation. They know their eternity, but they're really lukewarm on Israel, the land, the Jewish people. What would you say?
Well, I would say we've got to line up with God's heart. And if God has a heart towards the Jewish people, then that's where our heart should be, right? And we are living at a time of prophecy being fulfilled. Mitch, go back 100 years to 1908. Israel was, there was a little Zionist movement at that point. Some of the Russian Jews trickled there. They didn't come to America, they trickled there. There was some movement, a tiny movement. But Israel was nothing. It was just basically wasteland and swampland and that. So who in 1908, with the natural eye, not believing the Bible, but who would think that there'd be a modern Israel? And that the Jewish people would come back from all over the world, and they'd speak Hebrew, and that Jerusalem would be the capital again. See, now that's all, it was unthinkable, it was unheard of. Only people that had like faith in God's word could believe that. So we are living in the time of Bible prophecy.
Now, John, is it true, too, that Israel is the only nation that was destroyed and then born again?
It's more than that. Israel was destroyed in 600 BC by the Babylonians. The whole nation was taken captive, and they came back. That's unheard of. Usually what happened was they assimilated, when they took a people off the land like that, they'd assimilate them into their culture, and you never heard of them again. So the Jews come back. And then 600 years later, you have them being dispersed again by the Romans. Okay. And that dispersion is like 1900 years. And they're back in the land speaking the same language. There are no other people like the Jewish people. And the reason for that is that covenant that God made with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and their descendants. You cannot explain the modern state of Israel in light of all the persecution and all the suffering that they've had, in the destruction of their nation twice, complete total destruction, and they're back in the land speaking the same language. I look at that as supernatural. But that's the hand of God working in the affairs of man to fulfill his word.
More of The Crossover when we return.
I'm Jim Becca. I've been a journalism teacher for many years, and actually I wrote my first newspaper story in 1973. And I've seen the world change a whole lot in that time, covering a lot of different stories. But one thing that upsets me a little bit, and this is what I teach my students, is that truth can never be bested by falsehood in the public arena. But what happens when so much of what you see in the media is not the truth, and it's overbearingly, blatantly bad or anti-good? And that's why I was really concerned. That's why I think that the crossover can be a powerful instrument in reaching people, because it's actually proclaiming the truth, the positive side of a lot of different things, and reaching out to people.
For nearly 2,000 years, Jews and Christians have been divided. But now, God is calling for the healing of past hurts and the comforting of His people. Discover how God is prophetically uniting Jews and Christians across the world today on The Crossover. The Crossover exists to communicate to the Jewish community that there is a growing group of Christians who love them unconditionally. The focus of the Crossover program is to promote a greater understanding of the differences and similarities between Jewish and Christian customs, history, and theology, while encouraging a closer walk with the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. As a second-generation Holocaust survivor, Rosalie's Jewish heritage includes parents who were protected from the Nazis by Christians. Yet for more than a decade, Mitch and Rosalie searched for meaning in life in the New Age movement. But after returning to their Judeo-Christian roots, they discovered God's purpose for their lives: to rebuild bridges between Christians and Jews. Now through TV, radio, the internet, speaking engagements, the healing room, and print and video resources, they are reuniting Jews and Christians in fulfillment of biblical prophecy. Join Mitch and Rosalie as they tackle tough topics and welcome dynamic guests on The Crossover. The Promised Land.
And I also tried to make it very clear to the Christians all over the world that they are threatened to the same extent as the Jews and Israel are threatened. And I also say basically that Jews and Christians are waiting for the Messiah, who is a Jew from Israel who speaks Hebrew. And that Messiah is going to come to Jerusalem. And so Christians share this faith with the Jews.
The Hebraic roots of Christianity.
And we began looking at Jesus through Jewish spectacles and not our Texas spectacles or American spectacles.
Here again, Mitch and Rosalie Jerome.
10 years ago, I took a class with Dr. Richard Booker, sat in a room with over 30 people, mainly Christians, hearing them talk about the desire to help and serve the Jewish people and to help Israel. As a Jew, it totally shocked me, and I felt that more people needed to know, especially the Jewish community, that there's this growing group of Christians that love us unconditionally, not for the purpose of getting us to Armageddon or quickening the Messiah's return, but because they actually believe, this group of Christians, they actually believe that the Bible, from Genesis to Revelation, Old and New Testament, actually is the Word of God. And God says in Genesis 12:3, I will bless those who bless you, and I will curse those who curse you, speaking about the Jewish people.
Remember, these are prophetic times, and God is at work.
Come back again next week as we offer our hearts and hands as we reunite Jews and Christians to the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Shalom.
Shalom.
Join Mitch and Rosalie as they reach an ever-growing worldwide audience through The Crossover. We invite you to become a Crossover partner right now by calling the number on your screen. For your monthly gift of $30 or more, you will receive the Crossover Partnership Pack, which includes a DVD of today's program, a personal greeting and prayer message from Mitch and Rosalie, more information about the Crossover Project. As you continue to support the Crossover each month, you will receive a new Crossover DVD, plus a ministry report, and your name will be added to our healing room. Call now and join the growing family of Crossover partners.